Hey guys, what's up? PR here, coming to you from Zoom again. I hope you're all doing well amidst the quarantine and staying safe and healthy and not bored. And if you are bored, we have a lot of things to help with that. Check out the schedule we posted on Instagram. If you need it, text me. We post the events that we're doing on Zoom every day to keep you guys engaged and have fun. And there's been a lot of really fun ones. We had a good conversation in talking about theology last week about homosexuality. And multiple students came to that, and we had a really good discussion. Me and Ryan Melcher both shared. It was a great time. And we also had a lot of fun playing Jackbox last week. A lot of people came. It's a lot of fun. It's really easy to play on Zoom, and it's lots of laughs. So if you miss laughing with people during the quarantine, come this Friday for that. So last week I talked about what it means to give all of yourself to Jesus, and I talked about how important it is to follow Jesus in every area of your life and to give Jesus your everything. And I talked about how that means we cannot we cannot give part of our lives to Jesus or just our Sundays and Wednesday nights to God, but that we need to be thinking about how we live as Christians and how that impacts how we live every day in all areas of life. And I talked about how it needs to be a complete surrender to God in every area of your life. And that part of that is recognizing the sin in our own lives, not being okay with the sin and struggling against it. And at the end, I gave a chance for people who maybe haven't fully given all of themselves to God to do that. And to really give all of yourself to God and really embrace God fully and accept Him fully into all areas of your life in a new way. And I heard some feedback and response from some of the small groups from last week that this was a challenging message, and that some of you students listening were really challenged by it. And I heard that some people weren't sure how they felt about what this meant for them or what it meant for their identity as a Christian. And I heard that a couple students, at least, felt that if what I was saying is if they still have sin in their lives, that the challenge I presented was too hard for them, or that they weren't giving their all to God. And I want to clarify what I was talking about last week. So I want to say that I am not saying that you are not a Christian if you sin or if you choose to sin, because we all sin in our Christian walk. I sin in my Christian walk, and I also believe that even if you know for a fact you choose sin sometimes, that you can still be a Christian and love God, and that doesn't mean you're not a Christian and that you don't love God. However, the nuance in this is how we think about it, and that we cannot embrace sin as Christians. We cannot embrace sin as Christians. And we're going to talk about what that means and explore that a little bit today. And there is tension in this. There's tension in this in that it's hard to fully grapple with and fully understand and fully get what this means. And it's hard to live within this tension. And this probably sounds confusing, but I think it's made a bit more clear in more of Paul's writings from the book of Romans. So if you're here last week thinking that maybe I haven't truly given all of myself to God, if you were sitting there last week thinking maybe I haven't given all of myself to God, what we're about to talk about and the Bible verses we're about to read are for you. So we are going to be reading from the book of Romans, starting in Romans 7, verses 14 to 20. And starting in verse 14, it says, "So the trouble is not with the law, for it is spiritual and good. The trouble is with me, for I am all too human, a slave to sin. I don't really understand myself, for I want to do what is right, but I don't do it. Instead, I do what I hate. But if I know that what I am doing is wrong, this shows that I agree the law is good. So I'm not the one doing wrong. It is the sin living in me that does it. And I know that nothing good lives in me, that is, in my sinful nature. I want to do what is right, but I can't. I want to do what is good, but I don't. I don't want to do what is wrong, but I do it anyway. But if I do what I don't want to do, then I am not the one really doing wrong. It is the sin living in me that does it." So in this verse we see Paul, one of the most famous Christians of all time, who wrote most of what we talked about last week and what we read from the Bible last week. we see him wrestling with his sinful nature. And he recognizes that fundamentally he is a sinner. For he says, for what I want to do, I don't do, but what I hate, I end up doing. He is basically saying that he wants to do the right things, and he wants to love God with all of his actions, but so often he still ends up doing things he knows is wrong. And when he does sinful things, he says, he hates what I do. I hate what I do is what he says. And when he does these sinful things, it shows that he still falls into it, and it shows his humanity and brokenness as Christians. And that is our humanity, and that's your humanity and your brokenness, even if you are a Christian. We sin even though we know better. Even though we know the things of God, we still end up not doing them, because that is how broken we are as people. Paul, in this instance, he knows all what's right and wrong. He knows the law. He knows the Old Testament. And yet, he knows how he should act in love, and yet he still falls into sin. And that leads him to say, just as we read in verse 19, I want to do what is good, but I don't. And I don't want to do what is wrong, but I do it anyway. However, a chapter earlier in this, he addresses sin in a very different way. And if in Romans 6, so just one chapter before Romans 7, he's talking about sin, and he talks about it in a very different way. And if you aren't paying attention, it seems like he is saying the very opposite of what he just said. So I'm going to be reading from Romans 6, starting in verse 1, and then I'm going to jump around a little bit and skip some verses. So we're starting in Romans 6, verse 1. It says, what shall we say then? Shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase? By no means. We are those who have died to sin. How can we live in it any longer? Jumping to verse 12. Therefore, do not let sin reign in your mortal bodies, that you obey its evil desires. Do not offer any part of yourself to sin as an instrument of wickedness, but rather offer yourselves to God as those who have brought from death to life, and offer every part of yourself to him as an instrument of righteousness. For sin shall no longer be your master, because you are not under the law, but under grace. So why does Paul seem in almost a way to disagree with himself so much, and why do these verses have such different tones? Where Paul says, I do what I hate, and I do what is wrong, and I know it's wrong, and I end up doing it anyways, versus don't offer any part of yourselves as an instrument to sin. Why are these so different? And in these verses we just read, he seems to be saying that we need to rid sin from every area of our lives, and sin cannot be our master, as he says. Yet he also just said that he does what he hates. So what's going on here? And the tension that I want to call out in these passages is highlighted in these two verses, which I'm going to put on the screen. One from the first passage and one from the second passage. And I'm going to put these both on the screen. And I want to say, this is the most important takeaway I have for you today, is what I'm about to talk about in these two verses. This is the most important thing I'm going to say today that I want you as students and as leaders to hear. So please listen. So these two verses from Romans 6 verse 1, what shall we say then? Shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase? By no means. But then he says in Romans 7:19, what I want to do what is good, but I don't. And I don't want to do what is wrong, but I do it anyways. And this seems like a contradiction. It seems like Paul is contradicting himself only one chapter apart. But if we read deeper into what this means, we find that this is not a contradiction at all. And the point here that Paul is trying to make is that we are not to embrace sin because of God's grace and forgiveness. That is to say, we are not to say, I'm going to keep sinning and it doesn't matter because God's going to forgive me. So it doesn't matter that I sin, so I'm just going to keep on doing it. That's what Paul is saying in 6:1. Shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase? By no means. That is not okay to do as a Christian. To say, I'm going to sin because I know God is going to forgive me. You cannot say, I'm going to keep on sinning because God's forgiveness washes away my sin, so my sin doesn't matter. We as Christians are to identify sin and to reject it. We cannot embrace sin because of God's forgiving nature. We are to develop, in a sense, a hatred of sin. So my question for you listening is, do you hate the sin in your life? Do you hate your sin? And yet again, the second verse on the screen, even if we hate sin, as Paul says, we still will sin. We still will sin sometimes, even if we hate sin. And we see this chapter earlier, we see earlier in the chapter 7 verses, Paul says, I don't really understand myself. I want to do what is right, but I don't do it. Instead, I do what I hate. So we see here, Paul clearly says he hates his sin, even though he ends up sinning. And going back to the other verse, he wants what is good. He does want what is good, but he doesn't do it. He knows how the Bible is telling him to live, and yet he often doesn't end following it in every area of his life, and he messes up. He ends up doing what is wrong and sinful that he doesn't want to do. And this is the struggle we live in as Christians. And this is what I was kind of getting at last week when I was talking about giving every area of our lives to God. We are to hate sin in every areas of our life to God. That doesn't mean we won't sin. But because we are broken and sinful beings, but you have to hate sin. And I think for a lot of us listening, I don't think that you hate your sin. But that's what we are to do as Christians. We are to hate sin. And it is challenging. We cannot love sin. We cannot love sin and love God because those are opposite things. We cannot love sin and love God. Even though we will fall into sin at times, we cannot love sin and love God. So my challenge for those of you who felt uncomfortable last week is this: learn to hate your sin. And I want to clarify in some more practical ways what sin is and isn't that are specific and practical to where you are at in your high school life or your junior high life. And what I'm going to talk about now in terms of what's sin and what's not is my personal belief. So take them as advice from a pastor, not God talking. This isn't God saying this to you, but this is my advice and what I think as a pastor and as someone who has read the Bible a lot, and someone who has really studied and tried to give their life to ministry and serving God. So the first example I want to talk about is in the church, we encourage you to hang out with good people. Hang out with people who are good influences on you. That is a good thing. But it is not a sin to hang out with friends who are not Christian, and it is not a sin to hang out with people and be friends with people who aren't always making the best decisions or doing things that are bad. It's not a sin to hang out with people who do bad things. And I feel like often we make it sound like it is. And we see in the Bible, Jesus hung out with sinners. He hung out with tax collectors who were hated and considered evil people at the time. And he hung out with prostitutes. He hung out with the people who were the lowest in society because they were sinful during his time on earth. He hung out with them a lot. And so it isn't wrong to hang out with people who aren't perfect or people who do bad things or are messed up. However, it could become sinful if you are hanging out with a bunch of people who are influencing you in a negative way, and you are becoming more like those sinful people who really make bad decisions a lot. If you're becoming more like them, or they're making you struggle or fall short in your walk with God, or they are making you sin more because you are with them, then that is an area where maybe what you're doing now is sinful. It's not a sin blanket statement, period, to hang out with people who aren't Christians or people who make bad decisions. But if they are influencing you in a bad way and making you more like them, that's when it becomes a problem. That's when it could become a sin in a sense. So it's up to you as a Christian to use your best judgment and decide if your friend group is making you struggle in your walk with God. And if it is, then that might be something that is sinful and you might need to make a change. Another fun one, I also believe it is not. I believe it is not a sin to say a cuss word or say something that is considered a swear word. I don't think it's a sin to say a swear word. In the Bible, Paul actually wrote something in the Greek that was considered a vulgar word, or we might even call it a swear word for its time. However, I think, and the reason Paul said that was to describe the evil that a group of people were doing. However, I think it is a sin if you are cussing in anger, or if you're cussing in a way, that's leading other people astray, or you're saying bad things that are harming you in any way, or that are hateful to other people. For example, I think it is a sin to say, oh, I think that person is a bitch. If you're calling someone that, or if you're saying something like, oh, F that person, like F them, then you are saying it in a way that is malicious and harmful and angry. And in so doing, you are failing in your calls to love others as a Christian. And personally, I think cussing can be, and swearing can be a slippery slope that can lead to bad things and bad thoughts, kind of like what I was just talking about. And it also can lead some people astray in a way. And so that's why I choose to avoid cussing as much as possible, because I want to be above reproach. But I do not believe that saying a cuss word in of itself is inherently a sin. It depends, just like earlier, kind of depends on the context and what's going on around it. Another fun one, talking about schoolwork. I also believe it is not a sin to not turn in your homework. If you don't turn your homework at school, I don't think that's a sin. Maybe you were extremely lazy, and that might make it a sin in terms of laziness. But I don't think it's a sin to not turn in your homework, or to maybe not be super successful at school or anything like that, because we all have different paths. In college, I chose to not turn in assignments that were 0.5% of my grade, because I'm just like, it's not going to affect my grade that much. And I still got a pretty good grade. I don't feel bad about that at all. However, and this is a big one, I know a good amount of you listening have done this at least once. I believe cheating on a test or copying someone else's homework is absolutely a sin, and that's something that you should think about if you do that often. You are lying about your work, you are being academically dishonest, you're enabling your own laziness, and you're enabling yourself to learn to not do the work you need to do and not actually learn what you need to learn. And from a Christian perspective, not turning in your homework and getting a 0 is morally a lot better, or failing a test is morally a lot better than copying it or cheating on the test and lying about your work and your knowledge. So as a Christian, I challenge you to hate your sin, to learn to hate cheating on tests and hate copying other people's homework, and to work on kicking that out of your life. As a way of hating sin, you are to work on getting out of your life if that's something you're doing right now. Christians are to hate sin, so I challenge you to hate cheating on tests and things like that. In summary, I want to affirm those of you who felt uncomfortable last week with what I said. And what I want to affirm is this. I want to affirm you that if you take being a Christian seriously, and you feel in your heart that you truly love God, and being a Christian is something that is serious to you and important to you and influences your life, then you are just a regular Christian like me, doing your best, trying to survive day to day, figuring out what it means to be a Christian. I still am figuring that out in some ways, although, I've worked through it for years, but we're all still learning every day. But the challenge that I am calling us today, that is something you might need to start doing in your life for the first time, is to hate sin. Recognize where the sin is in your own life. Find the sin in your own life. Name it. Say, I know that I am talking smack about other people, that I am getting revenge on other people in ways, that I am holding anger and hate in my heart, that I am lying, that I am cheating on my tests. Find that sin in your own life and develop a hatred for it. Hate that you choose to do something that is against the heart of the God that we love and against how Jesus lived his life. Hate that you are not following the God that you, as a Christian, you are saying that you love. We love God, and because we love God, we want to do our best and live our best for him. And when we sin, we aren't doing our best. And that's okay, because we will all sin. But when we sin, the challenge is to hate it and try to use our emotional desire to do better and to want to do what is good, and try to use that and our hatred for sin to do better in the future. This is the wrestling I was talking about last week. This is the struggling with sin that we have to do as Christians. Let's pray. Dear God, I thank you that even though we are sinners who tend to sin all the time, that you sent your Son to die on the cross in our place for our sins, so that we may have eternal reward in knowing you, and eternal reward waiting for us in heaven, God. And I pray that you are with all of us. We are just regular people, regular Christians who make a lot of mistakes and are struggling to do the best we can day to day. But I also pray that in this, my heart, that in the students, the hearts of every student listening, and in the hearts of every leader listening, that you stir up a hatred for sin, that you make us hate the things that we know are wrong, that we learn to hate it so that we strive and want to not to do it, God. Not that we will be perfect, and not that we expect we'll be perfect, God, but that we learn that to hate sin so that we may use that to try and grow and to not do that anymore, and to improve the way we act and behave and learn and practice our faith in every day, God. And may that seep into every area of our life, God, because we cannot be a part-time Christian, we cannot be a Sunday Christian or a Wednesday Christian. We are a Christian 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 12 days a month, 12 months a year, just all the time, God. We are Christians everywhere we go, and we need to learn to hate sin in all areas of our life. We can't just be part-time Christians, God. So may that's something that you stir up in our hearts and help us to grow in as Christians, God. And may we do this in a way that we recognize we're doing this because we love you, God. We want to do what is right because we love you, and we know that you want us to do what is right, and we know that doing what is right is the best thing to do, God. And yet we fail so often. But may we not embrace sin, but may we hate sin and we will trip. But may we struggle and do our best not to trip, to try and do our best every day, God. And may we surrender all areas of our life to you. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. All right, well, thank you so much for tuning in, guys. I know that was kind of a lot, and you might have questions or wondering what exactly I meant. So if you do have questions about anything I said, please text me, ask, and let me know, and I would love to talk to you more about it. I encourage you, join us tomorrow at 5 p.m. for Talking About Theology on Zoom. Details will be on Instagram. And join us Friday at 3 p.m. for Jackbox Party Pack, the details of which will also be on Instagram. So have a great next few days, guys. Stay safe. I love you. I hope that everyone in your family and friends, everyone's healthy and thriving and staying well during this quarantine and keeping away from the coronavirus. So have a great week, guys. We'll see you next week. Have a good one.